Grace Hamilton had spent her entire life surrounded by luxury. As the founder of a billion-dollar technology company, she was recognized wherever she went. Private events, luxury hotels, designer clothing, and first-class flights had become normal parts of her routine. Yet despite all her success, there was one person who never cared about wealth or status: her 8-year-old daughter, Lily. Lily had a habit of seeing people differently. While adults noticed expensive watches, tailored suits, or luxury handbags, she noticed smiles, kind eyes, and lonely faces. Grace often admired her daughter's innocence, although she sometimes believed the real world wasn't as simple as Lily imagined. On a cool autumn morning, the two arrived at one of the busiest international airports. They were flying to Seattle for an important business conference where Grace would deliver the keynote speech. Reporters had already interviewed her before security, and several passengers quietly whispered her name as she walked toward the exclusive first-class lounge. Lily, however, paid no attention to any of it. She was fascinated by people instead. As they boarded the aircraft, a flight attendant warmly welcomed Grace by name and escorted them to their spacious seats near the front of the cabin. Grace settled in, opened her laptop, and immediately began reviewing slides for the presentation she would give the following morning. Lily looked around the cabin with curious eyes. Most passengers wore expensive business suits or elegant travel outfits. Some talked loudly about investments and company mergers. Others were glued to their phones. Then Lily noticed someone different. A few rows away sat a man wearing faded blue jeans, worn hiking boots, and a simple gray jacket that looked several years old. His dark backpack rested beneath his seat, and he quietly stared out the window without speaking to anyone. He didn't look wealthy. He didn't seem important. Yet something about him caught Lily's attention. She gently tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered softly, "can I sit with that man?" Grace barely looked up from her computer. "What man?" "The one by the window." Grace glanced toward him for only a second before returning to her screen. "No, sweetheart. Stay in your seat." "But he looks lonely." Grace sighed. "There are plenty of empty seats nearby. He probably wants to be left alone." Lily continued watching him. Every few moments the man would smile politely as passengers walked past, but no one stopped to speak with him. "He has kind eyes," Lily said. Grace smiled faintly. "You always think everyone has kind eyes." "I know," Lily replied. "But I think he needs a friend today." Grace finally closed her laptop. She looked more carefully at the stranger. There was nothing remarkable about him. No expensive luggage. No luxury watch. No designer clothing. Just an ordinary man traveling alone. Grace couldn't understand why Lily was so interested. The boarding process continued as the cabin slowly filled with passengers. Then Lily quietly asked again. "Please, Mom?" Grace hesitated. She didn't want to embarrass herself or interrupt a complete stranger, but Lily's hopeful expression made it difficult to say no. Finally she stood and walked toward the man. "Excuse me," she said politely. "This may sound unusual, but my daughter thinks you look lonely. She was wondering if she could sit here for a while if you don't mind." The man looked surprised. Then he smiled, a genuine smile that immediately softened his face. "I'd be honored," he replied. Grace thanked him before returning to her own seat, still feeling slightly awkward about the entire situation. Lily happily carried her coloring book across the aisle and sat beside him. Within minutes they were talking and laughing as though they had known each other for years. Grace couldn't help glancing over every few minutes. The man listened carefully whenever Lily spoke. He never looked at his phone. He never seemed distracted. Instead, he treated every question from the curious little girl as though it truly mattered. Soon Lily was showing him her drawings. He admired every single one. When she proudly explained her dream of becoming a veterinarian because animals deserve someone who understands them, the man nodded with complete sincerity. "That's a wonderful dream," he told her. "The world always needs more kind people." Grace watched from her seat, surprised by how naturally the conversation flowed. For the first time that day, she found herself wondering who this quiet stranger really was. As the flight continued, Grace found herself glancing toward Lily and the quiet stranger more often than she expected. Her daughter was completely at ease, chatting excitedly while showing him page after page of her sketchbook. The man listened with genuine interest, laughing softly at her stories and asking thoughtful questions that made Lily feel important. Eventually, Grace decided to introduce herself properly. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" she asked. "Not at all," the man replied with a warm smile. "I'm Grace. Daniel Carter." His handshake was firm but respectful. There was a quiet confidence about him that Grace couldn't quite explain. Unlike many people who recognized her name, Daniel showed no sign of being impressed. He simply treated her like any other passenger. Lily grinned. "Mom, Daniel says he has a son my age." Daniel nodded. "His name is Ethan. He's staying with his grandparents this week while I travel." "You must miss him," Grace said. "Every minute," Daniel admitted. "Being a single parent isn't always easy, but he's worth every challenge." Grace noticed the brief sadness in his eyes before he smiled again. For the next hour, they talked about parenting instead of business. Grace confessed how difficult it was balancing billion-dollar decisions with raising Lily. Daniel spoke about teaching his son honesty, courage, and kindness after losing his wife several years earlier. There was no self-pity in his voice. Only gratitude for the time he still had with his son. When the flight attendants served lunch, Daniel quietly thanked each of them by name after reading their name badges. His simple courtesy stood out in a cabin where many wealthy travelers barely looked at the staff. One flight attendant later leaned toward Grace and whispered, "He's one of the nicest passengers we've had all month." Grace smiled politely but remained curious. Who exactly was Daniel? He spoke with remarkable discipline. His posture remained straight without appearing stiff. He noticed every detail around him, calmly observing the cabin while remaining completely relaxed. Years of leading executives had taught Grace to read people, yet Daniel remained a mystery. As the plane began its descent, the captain announced that they would soon be landing. Passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. The moment the aircraft reached the gate, something unexpected happened. Before most passengers had even stood up, 3 uniformed military officers entered the cabin. Their eyes immediately found Daniel. One by one, they walked toward him. Then, without hesitation, each officer saluted. The cabin fell completely silent. "Commander Carter," the senior officer said with deep respect. "It's an honor to see you again. On behalf of everyone who served with you, thank you for what you did." Daniel looked slightly embarrassed. "Thank you," he replied quietly. "I was just doing my job." Another officer smiled. "You saved far more lives than you'll ever admit." Several nearby passengers exchanged confused looks. Grace stared in disbelief. Once the officers stepped away, a flight attendant quietly explained to another passenger that Daniel had spent years as a highly decorated Navy SEAL. Many of his missions remained classified, but among those who served beside him, he was considered a legend. Grace felt her face grow warm. She remembered her first impression of him, the faded jeans, the old jacket, the worn backpack. Without realizing it, she had assumed he was ordinary simply because he didn't look wealthy. Daniel gathered his small backpack, thanked the flight attendants, and prepared to leave. Grace quickly caught up with him near the terminal. "Daniel," she called. He turned with the same calm smile. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "I judged you before I knew anything about you." Daniel chuckled softly. "Most people do. Clothes are easy to see. Character takes longer." Grace lowered her eyes. "I've spent years teaching my company not to judge ideas too quickly, yet I forgot the same lesson applies to people." Daniel nodded. "My old commander used to tell us something I'll never forget." "What was that?" Lily asked. He smiled at her. "Character isn't something you wear, it's something you live." Lily repeated the sentence quietly, committing every word to memory. Daniel shook Grace's hand one final time before walking toward the terminal exit. A few moments later, a young boy came running through the waiting area shouting, "Dad!" Daniel knelt down and hugged Ethan tightly before the two disappeared into the crowd together. Grace watched them until they were out of sight. That evening, instead of preparing for her conference, she sat beside Lily in their hotel room. "What did you learn today?" she asked. Lily smiled. "That the nicest people don't always look important." Grace nodded. "No," she said softly. "Sometimes the truly extraordinary people are the ones who never need the world to notice." From that day forward, Grace changed the way she hired employees, treated strangers, and judged first impressions. But the greatest lesson wasn't hers alone. It belonged to an 8-year-old girl who simply looked at a lonely stranger and chose kindness first. Sometimes, one small act of compassion reveals a hero the world never expected.